Somewhere in Africa, perhaps around 1 million years ago, our ancestors began losing most of their body hair, not gradually thinned it out, not traded it for something else, lost it almost entirely, leaving behind bare, exposed skin, unlike anything else in the primate world. And then they did nothing about it for what may have been several 100,000 years. No clothes, no coverings, just naked, hairless bodies walking around the African savanna for a span of time longer than our own species, Homo sapiens, has even existed. It's one of the strangest, least discussed gaps in the entire story of human evolution. And once you understand why it took so long and what finally closed that gap, the real reason humans started wearing clothes turns out to be far stranger and far more layered than the simple answer most people assume. Let's start with the hair loss itself, because it's the piece of this puzzle almost nobody thinks to question. Every other primate on Earth is covered in thick body hair. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, all of them insulated head to toe. Humans are the dramatic exception, and for a long time, scientists weren't entirely sure why. The leading explanation ties directly to how our ancestors were hunting, as early hominins shifted toward long-distance persistence hunting, chasing prey across open, sun-scorched grassland for hours at a time until the animal collapsed from heat exhaustion. A thick coat of fur became a liability rather than an asset. Dense hair traps heat against the skin, and an overheating hunter in the middle of a multi-hour chase is a hunter who collapses before the prey does, losing that fur and replacing it with a body covered in sweat glands, more of them than almost any other mammal on Earth, turned humans into extraordinarily efficient long-distance runners, capable of dumping heat directly off bare skin through evaporation in a way no furred animal could match. Researchers studying human skin pigmentation genes have been able to estimate roughly when this transition happened, because losing body hair exposed skin directly to African sunlight for the first time, creating evolutionary pressure for darker, more protective skin pigmentation to guard against UV damage. That genetic evidence points to significant hair loss occurring somewhere around 1 million years ago, possibly earlier, long before anything resembling modern Homo sapiens existed, which means our ancestors solved one problem, overheating during a hunt, by creating another one entirely. A body with almost no natural insulation left at exactly the moment global climate was about to start swinging through repeated ice ages. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange. If losing body hair created a real vulnerability to cold, and clothing is the obvious solution to that vulnerability, you would expect the two things to line up fairly closely in time. They don't, not even close. For decades, archaeologists had almost no way to directly date the invention of clothing, because the materials involved, animal hides, plant fibers, early textiles, simply don't survive for tens of thousands of years. Stone tools last, bones last. Cloth and leather rot away almost completely, leaving nothing behind for a shovel to find, which meant one of the most important technologies in human history was, for most of the 20th century, essentially invisible to the archaeological record. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: lice. In the early 2000s, researchers realized they could use a clever genetic trick to work around the missing physical evidence entirely. Human head lice have existed on our species for millions of years, evolved specifically to grip hair shafts on the scalp. But there's a second distinct type of louse, body lice or clothing lice, that lives not on skin or hair at all, but in the fibers of worn clothing itself, only briefly moving onto skin to feed. Crucially, clothing lice can't survive without clothing to live in, which means they couldn't possibly have evolved into a separate species until clothing existed for them to colonize. By sequencing the DNA of both louse types and calculating how long ago they genetically diverged from a shared ancestor, scientists could effectively use lice as a biological clock for clothing itself. An initial 2003 study by researchers led by Ralph Kittler, published in the journal Current Biology, estimated the split happened somewhere around 72,000 years ago, give or take, placing the likely range roughly between 30,000 and 114,000 years. A more refined 2011 study, led by biologist David Reed at the University of Florida, using improved DNA sequencing methods, pushed the estimate to a median of roughly 170,000 years ago. Line that number up against the hair loss timeline, and the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Humans had likely been naked and hairless for several 100,000 years before clothing shows up in the genetic record. As David Reed himself put it, it's genuinely strange to think think that humans survived in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years with neither fur nor clothing to protect them, relying on nothing but bare skin, shade, fire, and behavior alone. The most obvious explanation is also the simplest. In equatorial Africa, you often just don't need clothes to survive. Daytime temperatures rarely dropped low enough to make bare skin genuinely dangerous, especially for a species that had already evolved efficient sweating and access to fire, shelter, and shade. Nakedness wasn't a crisis. It was simply the default, comfortable state for a hairless primate living in a warm climate. What eventually changed wasn't a sudden discovery. It was the climate itself. That roughly 170,000-year estimate, the earliest genetic evidence for clothing, lines up strikingly well with a specific, well-documented ice age known to climate scientists as marine isotope stage 6, a brutal glacial period running from around 190,000 to 130,000 years ago that dramatically cooled even parts of Africa. For a species with no fur left to fall back on, a sustained global cooling event like that would have been exactly the kind of pressure needed to finally make simple draped animal hides, worn purely for warmth, worth the effort. And it paid off in a way that reshaped the entire future of our species. Reed's research found that this genetic marker for clothing appeared roughly 70,000 years before modern humans began migrating out of Africa into colder, higher latitude regions of Europe and Asia. Without some form of insulation, that migration would have been close to impossible for a bare-skinned primate. Clothing wasn't just a comfort upgrade. It was likely one of the key technologies that helped unlock the colder parts of the planet for our species. A piece of equipment that let a tropical hairless animal survive winters it was never biologically built to handle. Clothing itself didn't arrive as a single invention. The archaeological record, once you know where to look, shows something closer to a slow, staged buildup of technology stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. The earliest hint isn't lice or fabric at all. It's stone tools shaped specifically for scraping hides, found at sites dating back roughly 780,000 years, long before the lice-based estimate for actual clothing. That timing gap is genuinely interesting on its own. It suggests early hominins were already processing animal skins for a very long time before those skins were regularly worn as clothing, likely using hides for other purposes first: bedding, simple wraps for carrying objects, protection while butchering carcasses, groundwork technology that only later got repurposed into something worn on the body full-time. For a long stretch after that, clothing itself was almost certainly simple and unstitched. Hides draped over the shoulders, tied or wrapped rather than shaped and sewn. That kind of clothing leaves the faintest possible archaeological footprint, which is exactly why the lice clock method became so valuable. It could detect the invention indirectly, chemically, long before any physical scrap of the clothing itself could ever be recovered from the ground. The next major leap shows up much later, and much more concretely, in the form of tools built specifically to pierce hide. At Sibidu Cave in South Africa, archaeologists have recovered bone implements interpreted as awls, dated to somewhere between 61 and 75,000 years ago, alongside a compound adhesive made from plant gum and ochre that's been dated to at least 71,000 years old. These tools mark a real technological shift, from simply draping a hide over the body to actively puncturing and joining pieces of hide together into something more deliberately shaped. But the true turning point, the moment clothing stops being a loose wrap and becomes genuine, tailored garment making, arrives with the invention of the eyed needle, a tool built specifically for sewing rather than just punching holes. The oldest confirmed example was discovered in Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, carved from bird bone, dated to somewhere around 50,000 years ago, a tool so precisely made it would likely still function today if you threaded it. What makes this particular discovery even more remarkable is who actually made it. Denisova Cave is famous for having sheltered at least 3 distinct human species over its history: Neanderthals, modern humans, and a third, mysterious population known only as Denisovans, identified almost entirely through DNA. Researchers attribute this specific needle not to Homo sapiens at all, but to the Denisovans themselves, meaning the technology of true, tailored sewing may not have originated with modern humans exclusively. It may have been independently developed, or at least shared, by an entirely different, now extinct branch of the human family tree. Bone needles like it become a genuinely common feature of toolkits across Eurasia after roughly 42,000 years ago, this time firmly in modern human hands, appearing alongside the remains of fur-bearing animals like foxes and hares, animals whose pelts are far more useful for warmth than for food, a strong signal that people were specifically hunting for fur to sew into fitted, insulating garments. That single shift, from wrapped hides to tailored stitched clothing, is widely considered by archaeologists to be one of the technologies that finally made it possible for humans to survive and settle in the most brutally cold environments on Earth. Researchers studying the spread of bone needles have directly connected this technological leap to modern humans successfully colonizing the extreme high latitudes of Siberia and eventually, by roughly 14,500 years ago, crossing into the Americas across the frozen north, a journey that would have been close to suicidal in loosely wrapped, unstitched hides alone. Here's a detail that adds an unexpected layer to the whole story. The earliest known bone awls used for working hide weren't made by modern humans at all. At a site called Grotte du Renne in France, archaeologists have recovered bone tools dated to roughly 42 to 45,000 years ago, associated not with Homo sapiens, but with Neanderthal remains, from a distinct toolmaking tradition known as the Châtel-Perronian. Use-wear analysis on these tools shows they were intensively used to pierce soft materials, almost certainly hides. That finding complicates any simple story where clothing was some uniquely human invention that separated us from every other hominin species. Neanderthals, it turns out, were also working leather with specialized bone tools. At roughly the same time, modern humans were doing the same thing in other parts of the world, and as the Denisova needle shows, Denisovans may have been doing it too. What seems to have differed wasn't the basic idea of processing hides at all, but likely the sophistication and consistency of the final product, with modern human sites showing an earlier and more widespread transition toward the fully tailored, needle-sewn garment style that would go on to enable deep, sustained survival in the coldest environments on the planet. Some researchers have speculated that this specific gap in the quality and fit of cold-weather clothing may have quietly played a role in why Homo sapiens ultimately expanded successfully into the far north, while Neanderthal populations, despite surviving European winters for hundreds of thousands of years, eventually disappeared. With all of this archaeological and genetic evidence pointing toward cold and survival as the driving force, it's worth directly addressing a much older, far more culturally popular explanation that humans started wearing clothes primarily out of modesty, a need to cover the body out of shame or sexual self-consciousness. That theory runs into a serious problem the moment you actually look at the ethnographic record. Anthropologists studying genuinely naked or near-naked hunter-gatherer societies, groups living with essentially no clothing well into the modern era, have repeatedly found populations that show no discernible shame or embarrassment about nakedness at all. If covering the body out of instinctive modesty were the original universal driver behind clothing, you'd expect that discomfort to show up consistently across cultures with minimal covering. It largely doesn't. Sociologist William Brew Thomas pointed out over a century ago that the logic behind modesty theory is almost circular. It assumes people covered themselves because they were ashamed of nakedness, without explaining where that shame would have come from in the first place in populations that demonstrably didn't have it. There's a genuinely strange, specific piece of ethnographic evidence that undercuts the simple story even further. European observers documenting Tasmanian Aboriginal communities in the early 1800s recorded women wearing capes made from wallaby skin. It would be easy to assume those capes existed for warmth, modesty, or decoration. According to the observers' own accounts, they weren't. The capes were functional tools, used primarily for carrying objects, including infants, hands-free. Clothing, in that specific case, wasn't about covering the body at all. It was about turning animal hide into functional equipment for an entirely different, practical problem. Put together, the honest picture that emerges is that clothing most likely began as a practical response to cold, not an instinctive response to nakedness, and that many of the functions we associate with clothing today, modesty, decoration, status, identity, layered on top of that original practical foundation much later. Once garments already existed, and cultures began attaching new meanings to something that had originally solved a much simpler problem, staying warm enough to survive a hairless body through an ice age. Step back far enough, and the full timeline of human clothing looks less like a single invention and more like a slow-motion layering of solutions. tools, each one solving a different problem, stacked on top of the last, across an almost unimaginable span of time. First came a very long stretch without fur, a bare-skinned adaptation for efficient hunting in the heat. Then came several 100,000 years of tolerating that nakedness, because in equatorial Africa, it simply wasn't a crisis yet. Then came hide processing tools, built long before clothing itself, likely for entirely different purposes. Then, as a specific ice age tightened its grip roughly 170,000 years ago, came the first simple, unstitched, draped hides, just enough insulation to survive a colder world. Then came awls and punctured leather tens of thousands of years later. Then, finally, somewhere between 40 and 50,000 years ago, came the eyed needle, tailored, fitted garments, precise enough to carry a tropical, hairless species across the frozen roof of the world, and, eventually, into an entirely new hemisphere no human had ever set foot on before. Invented, it turns out, not by one human species alone, but quite possibly by several. Every step of that chain likely solved a real physical problem before it ever became a symbol of anything else. Warmth may have come first, alongside other practical needs like carrying and protection. Meaning came later, layered on afterward, by cultures that inherited a technology whose original purpose had nothing to do with shame, sex, or status at all, and everything to do with a hairless animal trying to survive a version of Earth its own body had never evolved to handle. The next time you put on a jacket without thinking twice about it, it's worth remembering what that simple act actually represents, the likely end result of hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error, beginning with the loss of a coat of fur that once kept every one of your ancestors warm, and ending with a piece of technology precise enough to carry a fundamentally tropical animal into the Siberian Arctic and across a land bridge into a hemisphere it had never known existed. You're not just wearing fabric, you're wearing the solution to a problem your own species created for itself, long before anyone figured out how to fix it.